This is Making Better Decisions. I'm your host, Ryan Sullivan. Decisions are where rubber meets the road for organizations. Each week, we'll be learning from people who are on the front lines of turning raw data into better outcomes for their organizations. This show is sponsored by Canopy Analytic, helping companies make better decisions using data. Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Today, we have a special guest with us who brings a wealth of experience in financial planning and analysis. With over 10 years of FP&A experience, he's learned how business performance can be vastly improved through the use of data. He also has a focus in international business as well as finance, having studied in Beijing and picked up Mandarin, currently serving as an analysis manager at Precision AQ. Welcome to the show, William Bett.
Oh, it's really a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the flattering introduction, maybe bordering on exaggeration, but yes, thank you.
Welcome to the gas station. We're going to gas you up here.
Always welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we want to make everybody feel good. So we start everybody with the same question, and I want to hit you with it. What is the one thing you wish more people knew about using data to make better decisions?
A lot of different directions, but I think the piece that I try to emphasize is that it's important for everyone, and it should be approachable for everyone, meaning that you don't need to be a data scientist or some sort of data expert to be able to use data, um, especially if it's already been formatted for you. I don't expect you to be able to write SQL queries or create Power BI dashboards, but understanding the context, being able to translate that data into actionable insights in order to help you make those strategic business decisions that you mentioned. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've mentioned this a couple times in other podcast conversations, and obviously I'm biased being a data guy, but I feel like it's gotten to the point a little bit where it's almost like a computer, right? Like way back in the day, there were people who were like, "Oh, I don't really do technology. I'm like a pen and paper type of person."
yeah,
And it's like, well, surprise, surprise, you don't hear of a lot of people like that. You know what I mean? Like if someone
no,
is going to be capable of using technology, they're going to start outstripping people that can't. And it's kind of the same thing. People that use data, it's not like a separate skill. Like, sure, some of the things that you mentioned, some of the more complicated things, some of the more enterprise level things, sure, you want someone with a special skill set for that. But the idea that, we're making decisions purely on like gut feel, lightly informed by experience, it's like, those decisions will probably get surpassed by someone that can get information quickly and make a database decision. Now, one of the things that I am most excited to talk with you about is about FP&A. So we actually both come from FP&A. In fact, the same FP&A department. That's how we know each other. And for me, BI, business intelligence, analytics and reporting, that type of thing, and FP&A are, siblings or cousins, like very, very closely related. However, I think that there are a couple of key differences. So, first off, I think BI tends to be populated with a lot of kind of tech types, and FP&A tends to be populated with mostly finance and business types. Now, obviously, there's, like I'm splitting hairs here. Like everybody in FP&A has a tech, skill set, and most people in BI have some business chops. But I think that there's a little bit of a difference in perspective on FP&A that tilts it more towards business outcomes that I think is really good. I think everyone in BI and analytics can take a little lesson from that. I tend to be very focused on the business goals and trying to help to meet those. But there's also one humongous difference that people may not be aware of. And that is the actual like input of information and rendering like business opinions as a part of the reporting process, which is almost non-existent on the BI side of the house. With FP&A, It's like, okay, well, here's our forecast that, was put into some system and here it is on a graph. BI says, okay, good, done. FP&A may say, oh, well, at our last board meeting, they talked about making X, Y, or Z strategic changes. So we need to edit for that, or we're going to build 5 or 6 different scenarios to look at different scenario analysis, things like that. Talk to me a little bit about your perspective on the difference between FP&A and BI and what types of things are unique on the FP&A side.
Yeah, I think you really nailed it. I think of BI as more people who understand what's going on under the hood, have a real tech, expertise for the technical side of things, and maybe that's just what they love doing. They love kind of building a data architecture, whatever else goes into it. FP&A, I find it enjoyable because I like solving puzzles. And I mean that like really in every sense of the word, whether it's an actual puzzle or how does this all fit together? Or how do those forecasts make sense? And why do they not make sense? And so for FP&A specifically, I find that you're constantly sort of tinkering and testing what you put together for forecasts, or why does the budget make sense, or why does it not make sense? And that's, I think, what keeps me interested the most. There's always going to be the kind of not rote memorization, but the stuff that you do on a regular basis that is part of the job. But then there's the more interesting piece for me, and I think for a lot of people, is how does this all make sense, or does it make sense, and how do we become, we use more jargon, but value added to the organization, right? I feel a lot of people see FP&A and even BI as just a cost center for a company. Um, and I think that perception is slowly changing, depending upon where you work and what you do exactly. But I think for FP&A, it's really about helping people make sense of the data, telling that story, um, using those scenarios to say, hey, this is where we could be on the low end. This is kind of that soft landing in the middle. And this is our optimistic picture for the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, whatever time period you want to look at. And so I think those things are really critical in order for you to be successful. It's like, how do you take that dashboard that maybe someone in BI built and tinker with it and use it as a tool to um, gain more insight and relay that. I think that's the last piece of it that a lot of people
Mm,
maybe don't necessarily have time for. Unfortunately, I think a lot of times people get kind of rushed through the month-end process or the year-end process or budget or whatever it might be, and they really feel like they're missing out on that really critical piece of FP&A.
yeah. I love the storytelling aspect of that because it's a word that gets used a lot, borderline thrown around.
Yeah,
Um, I really think that it just comes down to, can I make the right decision or some kind of like spectrum, like over a trade-off of decisions? Can I make that crystal clear? So presumably the information that we need should exist or we can go out and get it. Once we have that, like ideally there's either one right decision or like a spectrum of decisions depending on what you want to optimize for. And
yep,
if I can clearly communicate that to someone else where they don't just see like a bar chart and make their own inferences, where like they clearly understand like this is the information that I need in order to accurately make the decision that is best for the organization. Um, to me, that's the story that we want to tell. Now, obviously, most of our audience are kind of decision maker and up level. So talking, super nitty gritty about, hey, here's how this function works, right? That's typically
yeah,
not, our shtick. But one of the things that I think is, again, very interesting, like when we contrast BI with FP&A, is around what types of tools get used and why. And my general take is that it mirrors a lot like what tools we use are just tools that we use to achieve our function, right? It's like, building some pie in the sky architecture, what's the value, right? If I can't say that's a problem. In BI and data engineering and analytics, like kind of most of what my world is right now. Like it's a lot of like going and grabbing data, connecting the data, shaping the data, building some sort of model, getting visualizations built on top of that and allowing people access to like different levels of, kind of different layers of, rawness of the data so that they can do their stuff. In FP&A, my experience was there are a lot of very diverse demands placed on an FP&A team. So the CFO may wheel in and ask a question, and now it's like, okay, well, in this situation, I have to know the source systems, go to those source systems, pull the information, do that whole process that I just talked about we do in BI. But then there also may be something like, hey, a different type of question comes in, and you already have the model for that built, maybe by yourselves or by someone on an analytics function. So then you have to know that stuff and how to access it and how to interact with it. And then there's that other portion that I mentioned, which is like the model type imbuing business logic and then like making business kind of like opinion decision calls with the data. And for me, those first two, like they're like good, powerful enterprise tools. They allow for centralization and source control, all these fancy things that imbue and like type information into a report and see how it changes the scenario analysis stuff. In my personal opinion, is still kind of very firmly in the domain of Excel. And what I've found is that you kind of get like one of two things that happens. Either you go the like modern, cool new tech for the whole thing, or you go with we do Excel and we're super hardcore at Excel and we don't even need to touch our mouse. It's all keyboard shortcuts. Look at us.
The ruler tapping your knuckles.
Talk to me a little bit about, when you're required to understand so much horizontally, both from a business and from a tech perspective. How do you pick the right tool for the right job for a given situation? And how is it even possible to get and stay upskilled and all that stuff?
Yeah, man, this is, I think it requires a real personality type and someone who is always eager to learn. I've worked across Excel pretty heavily. I've worked with Tableau and MicroStrategy and now Infor. And, I will never have the depth of a technical expert, but I still have to be able to understand how these work and how they fit together. And like you said, the purposes for each. So maybe during month-end reporting, I'm using our ERP to get the source of truth for the financials, but then I have someone come in with an ad hoc request, and let them go in Excel because it's just easier for me to build a model that says these are the inputs, these are the expected outputs, these are your potential scenarios, and so it's man, it some days are great where you're like, okay, yeah, I know exactly what I need to do, and then something new comes in, and you're like, has anyone done this? And so I think one of the things that I've enjoyed in my current role has been the development of like a FP&A center of excellence, right? So we have a smaller group across the organization uh, with varying levels of experience and abilities, right? So that's been extremely helpful to say, hey, have any of you seen this, whether it's here or elsewhere? How would you approach the problem? And I think oftentimes people feel like they need to solve things by themselves, or that if they don't
Mm,
think of it themselves, then why am I here? Right? Like, why do they need me? But um, I think that's actually a real sign of maturity. And I think I would go back. You mentioned we worked together a long time ago. And that was like, I think the stereotypical like imposter syndrome. If I don't know this, like, I'm going to be found out. But I think as you grow in your career, it becomes really, really important to you to raise your hand sooner than later.
mm.
And, part of that can simply be like, I don't understand how this tool works. How am I thinking about this? Am I on track or not? Um, so all these things, when you talk about that, the different tools and how do you use them, I think that's a big part of FP&A is. being efficient with your time and resources, and how do you get to the answer as efficiently as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, that piece of the puzzle, you're right, took me some time to learn. I think especially I still lean really heavily on the fact that I kind of started on the business side of the house and I enjoy understanding economics and business management theory and all those things. I try to keep those skills really sharp and I am still a believer that everything we do on the tech side of the house is to try to further the business's goals. But I definitely took a very technical route to get there. Um, and that kind of continues to today being a technical consult. Most of the times people aren't bringing me in to say like, "Can you have a look at our balance sheet?" Like they're they're bringing me
Yeah,
in to be like, "Yo, go build this thing. I don't know how to build."
right.
And I think especially on the tech side of the house, I also experienced that imposter syndrome, but it's also like, as a technical expert, someone's kind of paying you to know what to do or at least figure it out really, really fast and efficiently. And I think what you touched on is exactly how I feel about it, even on, kind of a more tech parallel is just, I don't have to know everything. But I have to be transparent about what I know and what I don't know, and I have to have both the appetite and the ability to learn things fast when they're appropriate for me to be the one to learn.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a big responsibility in FP&A is saying, I don't know, but I can get the answer. That not only applies for if someone asks you, a business question, but how can we do this? Within FP&A, how can we build these reports? How can we do this? And so, being able to understand that, and I think putting the two sides together, right? Like I don't want to be seen as a taskmaster or someone who's got the stick um, on the people who are out generating revenue, but I want to be a partner. And I know that again, like I keep these these business jargon kind of makes me cringe a little bit, but it's true. Like I don't need to be your friend, but I need to help you get to where you need to go because ultimately that's my job, right? I want to be able to help us understand how we can grow this business, how we can optimize our resources to mitigate the downside, right? There's always a business cycle, regardless of industry. And so sometimes everything looks great. And it's not really any different than, if you play any sports and you're winning all the time and like, oh, this is so easy. This is so easy. You know, you don't think about the downside. You don't think about these different things that can go wrong necessarily. And that's the other part of it too, is like it's easy when things are working and you're not having any issue getting your forecast, your other goals. But how do you adjust when you're not? And how do you help the business adjust? And I think that's been, for the last year or two for a lot of people in FP&A is how do you protect that? How do you kind of, get a softer landing as you can, the business?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that really no matter where you are in the cycle, I think there's definitely like a little bit less stress on the upswing, right? Because it's just like, well, how well are we gonna, right? As
Right.
opposed to like minimizing how bad we're gonna do. That feels a lot worse.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very stressful. Like, not to go into too much detail, but, it's really stressful because you're gonna be making decisions about people's future employment, and what does that mean for them, and, it's part of the business too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that a lot of the brass tacks of business is hard. Business is hard, right? That's really what it
Yeah.
comes down to.
Yeah, it
Business
is.
is hard. Um, Although I liked what you talked about a moment ago as far as kind of trying to combat some of that imposter syndrome and trying to get better outcomes around the center of excellence. I was wondering if you could share some of your experience with that. I've worked with a lot of clients that they know that this is valuable. They know that getting their smart people, their experienced people as resources for one another and on a regular cadence of talking about what everybody's working on and making sure that to the degree it's possible they're swimming in the same direction. Like this, you hear this idea and everyone's like, good idea. We like this idea. Let's do this idea. However, I think that execution has been something that I've seen organizations struggle with. Like, it's usually pretty easy to make some identification of like, these are the people who are the correct blend of competent and experienced. I think what's harder then is how do we set up a framework where it doesn't just become like a fluffy name or like another pointless meeting on some of your most valuable people's calendar. So talk to me a little bit about the value gen side of a center of excellence and where you've had success and what maybe some of the challenges have been.
Yeah, I don't want to make it seem like it's a simple or easy thing to do, right? For a lot of people, it's very difficult to execute, and it could be for a variety of reasons. It could simply be because the personalities don't fit amongst your teammates, your coworkers. Maybe the tools aren't really good fit, or maybe in some cases the different business units aren't aren't similar enough. So not really. I'm like, how do I translate what I do for this business unit this business unit? Does it even make sense? Even look at it the same way. So these are some of the growing pains, because some of the struggles that we're currently going through, and I think for for us, we found a lot of value with regular check-ins. They don't need to be particularly long. I think, like you said, a lot of people are very, very busy, or they just get meeting fatigue, right? Like, could this have been an email, right? Like, or whatever. Um, and so I think for us, we've had a lot of success aligning some of the business units, some standardization, some more efficiencies for reporting and resource use, but there's still a lot more to go. And I think that's also how you have to look at it. There's never really a finish line. Business is going to change. The external environment's going to change. The internal environments are going to change. And so you just kind of continuously adapting. And sometimes that's um, at a relatively slow pace. And other times you're like your hair is on fire because you're trying to, you know, respond to requests from people at the top who really don't have even less time than you do, and they
Yeah.
need results right away. So it's a difficult balance. I don't want to pretend like it's been easy or that it is easy, but I think it's worth the effort over time.
Yeah, I've had similar experiences. It's one of those things where which I get I was gonna say like this is a specific class, but this is generally applicable to everything. But like, what you put into something is what you get out of something. So it doesn't if I'm gonna buy in, and if I'm not, don't. Right? So like the organization either decides, hey, we're gonna do like a center of excellence isn't one thing. That's just like a name.
Right.
Right? So it's kind of like, well, what am I trying to get out of this center of excellence? And then build that and only that. And if we want to add something to it, then we add something to it. Because for different organizations, I've kind of seen a lot of different pieces of that puzzle. Like, I think that one thing generally that's valuable is having some sort of kind of like communication network, whether that's, a Slack channel or an email group or something where these
Yep.
people can just like you said, kind of throw something out to the brain trust and see if anybody's seen that. Hey, do you know where this is? Do you have experience with that? It's just a lot
Yeah.
quicker than other methods of communication. I think it's also super valuable when we have kind of cross team projects. So let's say, you're doing a major budget overhaul based on a sales reorg. Okay, well, whoever is in the center of excellence in sales and then whoever's in the center of excellence in FP&A, let's have those two people run the project. Like that's a great
Yeah.
way of collaborating from a cross team perspective. I think the rest really depends very heavily on the organization. So, for example, in like BI analytics, data engineering, all that stuff, I would say one of the many major problems that get run into is, different people making different versions of the truth. So, like having some sort of kind of like logical ownership structure and like this person signs off on the numbers for each business unit, like you mentioned, I think that's another really good use. But another company that has like completely centralized analytics may find no value in that. They're like, well, we already have the team that does that. So that's really interesting. Talk to me a little bit about data culture, particularly from the FP&A side. When I hear lots of people in my space talk about data culture, that's kind of code for like finding really smart technical people and then somehow teaching them to talk business. But for you, it's kind of the total opposite, being on, a little bit of the other side of the equation. So what does data culture mean to FP&A, and what have some of your successes and difficulties been trying to build that?
I wish I had a whiteboard behind me because you would see that FP&A generally sits at the very end of the data stream, right? So maybe there's someone on the intake and someone else, and maybe you're, let's say, 6th or 7th in line for the actual data. And so it really becomes, garbage in, garbage out, and I think that's such a it's sad but true. I think a lot of times, people at FP&A like, "Ah, yes, simply because I took this out of the ERP or I exported to Excel, this is all clean data, and I can go ahead and use it and get to the proposed solutions that I'm looking for," and it's rarely, if ever, like that. I think the challenge for a lot of people is cleaning the data like you talked about, making sure that what we have is as accurate as it can be. And just as a short example, I think one of the toughest pieces for us over the last year or so has been pushing back on how Salesforce data is used, and that the integrity of the data, um, being able to have historical records for all the stuff that's in there, because oftentimes we were finding that stuff was being changed and there was no like process. And so then you'd have to make sense of what happened. You you really couldn't. I mean, I couldn't. I felt like I was just making stuff up sometimes. But uh, data culture for us is really being able to say, we know this is true because it's all coming from the same place. We know what this means because we have the definitions for each of these pieces of it. And we're able to translate that to the people who are ultimately going to be receiving it. Right. I think that's a challenge. It's a real challenge because again, like people can be in a hurry or people can be maybe just inexperienced or don't care, whatever it is. And so having the culture in place to make sure that the checks are in place, to make sure that the information is accurate, and making sure we get it done in a timely fashion. Is that kind of hit on the highlights, or is there something else
I
that you were thinking about?
No, absolutely. I think another thing that I'd be interested to know, and this is kind of related to data culture, is around people. So when you're either kind of like evaluating people on a team or, interviewing or hiring somebody in FP&A, how important really is, data or tech skills? I mean, and obviously, like, the right answer on the data podcast, it is super, but, I think obviously we talked about it. You guys have a very broad set of skills, most of which are really on the business side. Talk to me a little bit about, how important are like the hard data skills and, the data mentality for people on an FP&A team?
Yeah, people come in with a wide variety of experiences and abilities, and so I think that's more of a it's a culture fit, right? I think why I don't have to be best friends with the person, but I want to somewhat enjoy working with them and having like a base understanding. But it also goes back to what we talked about already, which is just like a curiosity or like a tinkerer's mentality, right? I think that's a
Mm,
big piece of what makes people successful in FP&A because you're going to have a wide variety of tools and you're just not going to have time to be, I can play around in BI, but I'm not going to be building as elaborative dashboards as developers or someone else, right? It's not what I do. Um, and so I think having like a basic grasp of tools, having an interest in learning more, is is really helpful. And I think just being open to listening, right? You know, pick on myself again. Aside from being an imposter, I think for a lot of people, it's hard to hear criticism, um, even if it's constructive, right? Not like, "Oh, you're a terrible person," but like, "This would be better," right? Like, it's nothing personal. It's just like, "Hey, man, like, I know you can do this. Spend a little more time. If you need help, I'm here to help you, and we can work on this, and it'll make your life much easier in the long run, right? Like, you don't need to suffer through this every month. If it's a regular reporting piece, you don't need to suffer through it. Kind of brute forcing your way through this stuff. Like, we can work together to make this more efficient or just easier to do. And so I think just really the mentality is a big piece of it. Technical skills, great, yes, but like we've talked about, a lot of it comes down to how do you tell the story?
Mm.
Why should I care? Like, if I'm a C level or executive level making decisions for the whole organization, like, why should I care? I mean, whatever. You use some fancy new tool, it doesn't matter. Um, right? It matters what you're trying to tell me.
When you were just talking, you mentioned, kind of those regular reports that get done in FP&A. And for those that don't know or come from FP&A, I would largely categorize the work that you do to be kind of in two fairly separate camps. Like one is whether it's weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual, like these kind of budgeting cycles, forecasting cycles,
Yeah.
annual or quarterly financial reporting cycles. All of that stuff tends to be on a regular, predictable cadence, right? Like we know what our fiscal year is, we know when earnings go out, whatever the case.
Yep.
The other is basically just kind of this mishmash ad hoc of unpredictable. Somebody has a question, we're the right people to answer it, go get an answer and do it fast and make sure that it's super right.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about how you balance that and around some of those spikes, right? Like I remember what it's like. Like you kind of have sure some ad hoc reports and some stuff to do, but like life is very different in the middle of a quarter versus the end of the quarter. So talk to me a little bit about balancing.
Yeah, it's always sort of on the edge of the knife, right? Like you talked about with the regular reporting, you can mostly expect what you're going to get into, what the workload is going to be like. But then someone drops something else on your lap, or there's a new wrinkle this time, and you have less time to do it. And so something that I have continued to work on for myself and continue to encourage others, is just like do it when you have the time, not when you think you have the time. That makes sense, right? Like sometimes it's nice to just kind of zone out for 30 minutes or take a quick walk if it's nice outside because you've been staring at spreadsheets for hours. But if you can get it done because inevitably something's gonna come up. And I think that's the hardest
Mm.
balance, right? And then, fortunately where I am now, I don't have too much imbalance. I think there's times where I've had to maybe stay up a little bit later than I'd like, or even start early just when it's quiet so that I'm not distracted by other people or, message teams messages or whatever it might be. But just giving yourself more time than you think it takes, right? And I think as a recent example, just having issues with Salesforce and pipeline and why the numbers aren't what they're expected to be and having to spend a lot more time in the details
Mhm.
has been, you know, the latest wrinkle. And it's an important one because that's the lifeblood of the organization, as I think it is for really anyone, right? If you don't have clients paying you, then like how are you going to stay in business?
Yeah.
And so, just being able to say, okay, now that I have to do this, and I know I'm going to be doing this on a regular, semi-regular basis, then how do I balance it with this other stuff I already know is going on? So
Yeah.
never ending again. Just being adaptable.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. 100%. That was definitely one of the biggest takeaways from my time in FP&A was the ad hoc stuff is unplannable. That's why we call it ad hoc. But for the things that are plannable, information about the future is extremely valuable. And knowing that I'm going to have a predictable amount of demand on a predictable date and what is involved in that process is really, really, really valuable planning information.
Yeah.
And so when I made the jump from FP&A into BI and then into consulting, that lesson was one that I carried with me. And so I've done over the course of my consulting career a lot of training, right? Thousands of people, like mind-boggling amount of like travel and training
Yeah.
and all this. My biggest mantra for most of this type of person is buy 5 minutes of your life back at a time. So, like you mentioned, if you're in one of those situations where you're not in a full sprint mode, and you know that you can invest an hour, but then that saves you 5 minutes a week in perpetuity. So like for me, anything that is known and has the possibility to be improved is, this word is so overused, but this I think is a correct application, is very leveraged,
Mm.
right? I mean, leverage does not mean use. It means that there's some sort of lever. There's a force multiplier. So like
Yeah.
that 1 hour of time, assuming that the business lasts forever and so do I, right, has infinite return.
Yeah.
So for me, that was kind of the big takeaway of the balance is like, if it's ad hoc time, do your stuff. If it's regular reporting time, you got to run the process as is. But anytime there's that gap, like attacking that future stuff, that wave that I know is coming,
Right.
that helped. That saved a lot of time.
And not just time, but a ton of save you a ton of stress, right? I think that's the
Mm,
big thing. Because, knowing myself, I think that's easy for people to get sloppy and to make just silly mistakes, right? You're in a hurry and you don't necessarily have all the time to double check or triple check formulas or whatever it might be if you're using Excel or just like, whoops, I clicked the wrong period on this dashboard or whatever before I exported it. Or there's something, right? And then you're like, God, if I had to spend a little bit more time or had a little more time, then you could save yourself a ton of stress as well. I think that's what keeps people from burning out, right? If you have a ton of work
mm.
to do and you're constantly stressed about it, you're having nightmares or something else that is not like I don't have nightmares about that. I don't have nightmares about dinosaurs or something, right? I don't worry
Yeah.
about Excel eating me. Um, so that's another big piece, and I think you really nailed it. I think there's almost like an exponential return. If there's stuff that invest a little bit of extra time and effort, it'll pay off in perpetuity, right?
Yeah. I think to bring it full circle, one of the things that you mentioned earlier was essentially that you want to try to not just be a cost center. You want to try to focus on like, where are the places where instead of just answering questions, we can surface things that someone may not have thought about.
Yeah,
Sometimes that just, hey, I was doing this analysis and like this looked a little off. So I poked at it and like,
yeah,
turns out we're like paying for a bunch of stuff we don't have to be paying for. Like that's immediate bottom line impact. Like that's the way that
right,
it started for me. But the more that I can both free up the time to make this a reality, but also make it an actual like goal and mandate, like, hey, we want you all to go and look for spending inefficiencies or places where we can do X, Y, or Z to try to help move the company forward.
yeah,
That to me is not only way more value adding, but as the people doing it, like infinitely more interesting than just like hammering together two exports.
right,
I would love, obviously, like the buying 5 minutes of your life back at a time is a piece of that. But I would love to get your take on, maybe it's that, maybe it's another approach. How does FP&A move from just kind of being a cost center question answerer, which is very important and valuable, into the space where on top of that, they can also surface things that weren't asked for and actually play a role in driving the organization forward?
yeah. Wow. I should get promoted if I could answer this cleanly. No, I think for some companies, it's really identifying where you are losing money and where you can grow your money. And I think in a time like we are now, it's really important that you focus on growing your money. I think for us, a big effort has been to identify clients we are already doing business with that we could do more of. We already have an existing relationship. We don't have to invest in trying to establish or even like support one to like, hey, we already do this for you. How about we do this for you? And maybe that's a different line of service, and maybe that's a different type of product or something else. And so I think really the value added portion is, hey, we've identified these 5 clients. They drive X%, let's say majority of the revenue. What else can we do with them? Right. Rather than trying to like spend all this time doing business development. Not that it's not important, and that you shouldn't always be having a pipeline, but I think it's far easier, right? If you already have established relationships to help them grow. And maybe it's not necessarily for your business unit, but maybe for one of the other ones. And that's still a win for the organization. And so that's a really big focus. I think the focus on just kind of optimization of resources, like you mentioned, whether that's billable staff or how are we spending our money, right? Is it what are we getting for it? Or and that's a big part of FP&A. I think we would be familiar with is what is your variance analysis, budget or the forecast and why? And that's really the bread and butter of FP&A is like every month you're looking at stuff and saying, that doesn't look right. Or why do we forecast this number? And why is it lower or higher? Or, maybe that's good or maybe that's bad. And being able to get into the detail, say this is what's causing it, this is what we can do. Or maybe it's I think the joke is that it's just timing, right? It's just timing, and we'll balance out. Maybe that is true. Maybe it's just late in being booked or whatever. But other times, it's something that is gonna kind of blow up in your face later if you don't handle it. So all that to say, I think FP&A is really most helpful when it's identifying opportunities. I think it's easy for people to say, you're just telling us when we're doing bad or not hitting our targets. Really, it's about identifying opportunities. I think that applies in a lot of different areas of the business. So,
Yeah. Well, hopefully you get that promotion you mentioned, because that I thought was really clean. That was actually really tangible, right? Talking about, because you're right, like the variance analysis, like against a budget or a forecast really is that key tool. And getting extremely good at talking about, sure, not just the where did we miss the mark, but where did we succeed? How can we expand on those successes? Like, you know, all of that stuff, I think, is a really tangible way that teams are currently positioned to increase their value. So I think that that is, really tangible. It's awesome. Thank you so much for that.
no, you're welcome.
I I want to change up gears and talk a little bit less about, FP&A and experience and data and all that stuff. And I want to talk about Will. I love to give the listeners a chance to get to know who it is that they're listening to. So tell me a little bit about yourself. What's your background? What do you like to do outside of work? Give people a good picture of you.
Yeah. So you can see some pictures behind me. Those are from a couple of my children, and I'm trying not to get emotional about it, but it's just fun. It's fun for me to be able to uh, kind of talk to them about what I do, and that goes back to puzzle solving. I had to do a presentation for one of their classes, and like, how do I explain this to a 4-year-old, right? Like, what spreadsheets? No. Like Excel? No. Let's talk about that. And so it's just like, hey, like, I solve number puzzles and I help people make better decisions. Like, wow, that sounds like a lot of fun. I love puzzles. And so, when I'm not grinding spreadsheets and doing presentations for people within the organization, I love coaching. I love mentoring, and that becomes really useful in a lot of different areas of life, whether that's my own children or coaching youth sports or coaching some of the younger people who maybe are just a year or two out of school and they're like, what does FP&A do? I just thought it sounded interesting, and here I am. And so just being able to talk through stuff with them, I think is really important. I love organize a weekly pickup basketball game with a lot of other parents and community members here in Cambridge, and I just love the community. I can't quite hoop like I used to, but I'm still out there running up and down the court. And fundraising has been a big piece of it. I've been involved with I call it a for-purpose organization in Cambridge for about 15 years now that provides uh, halfway houses for those with mental health issues, and that's been a really consistent thing for me in the background. Like, how can we help this organization evolve? How can we help them raise money? And now I'm raising money for St. Jude's Children's Hospital. There's a 5K walk run coming up in Boston at the end of September, and I'm excited to carry the boats during that race and just try to enjoy what time I have when I'm not at work, and being able to kind of give back.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. That stuff is close to my heart as well, so love to hear, you know, someone else is carrying the boats. Um, if anybody loved what you had to say, has a question, wants to reach out or get into contact with you, what's the best way to reach out?
I love the bots. I love the stories about business to business sales. So LinkedIn is probably the easiest place to find me. People don't know. I love memes. I mean, it's just
Uh,
incredible. So LinkedIn, you can find me. I'm probably the only William Bett. If you're unsure, I'm wearing a bow tie, so that's formerly known as the bow tie assassin in one of our previous roles. Just because I think you also have to protect the business of people who aren't necessarily um, looking out for looking out for it. So LinkedIn, you could probably find another contact email address on there as well. Or if you're in the area, feel free to come out Thursday night basketball. Love to hoop with you and
That's right.
maybe help me throw one down.
That's right. Some regular alley hoop action out there.
Yeah,
I love it.
yeah,
All right. Well, this was absolutely incredible and super valuable. It was a fun opportunity to catch up and hear a little bit more about how your career has really blown up since we last worked together, which, as you mentioned, was almost a lifetime ago. I can't thank you enough for coming on, sharing your time, sharing your expertise, and as you mentioned, kind of helping to coach some of the listeners and give them your side of the story. Really appreciate it.
yeah. Thank you for the invitation. It's really been enjoyable, and I just encourage you. I think the succeed and proceed mantra of learning, and I apply that to people that I work with now. I said, if you can't see yourself staying here for a long period of time, hopefully you can learn some skills that will make you valuable elsewhere, and just succeed and proceed, man. So that's what it comes down to. So
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I also want to make sure to thank the audience, especially if you have made it this far. Thank you so much for listening. Please make sure that if you liked it, if you stayed this long, that you make sure to give us a like, a subscribe, tell a friend, give us a review, hopefully a good one. All of that stuff is a huge help to keeping the podcast running. Will, thank you again so much for being here. And this has been another exciting episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Thanks. That's a wrap for today's episode of Making Better Decisions. For show notes and more, visit makingbеттerdecisions.live. A special thank you to our sponsor, Canopy Analytic. Canopy Analytic is a boutique consultancy focused on business intelligence and data engineering. They help companies make better decisions using data. For more information, visit canopyanalytic.com. There's a better way. Let's find it together and make better decisions. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next week. Peace.